All right. Well, hello, everybody. Good morning, evening, afternoon, whatever it happens to be for you on your side of the world. I'm excited to talk here today at another Prismatic Insider, this time about building faster with an AI coding agent. My name is Taylor. If you've not met me before, I'm a developer experience engineer here at Prismatic. My job is to just make sure that the developers who are, our largest portion of our customer base have all the tools that you all need to be successful with our platform. I want to kick off today with a quick poll. As you've been building things with an AI assistant, I'm curious what your biggest development challenge is here today. Um, I've run into all of these things with AI agents lacking some sort of context. I've certainly hit some hallucination issues and some hilariously so. Sometimes I've got some inefficient token usage. Or if you've got anything else, go ahead and throw it in the Zoom chat. While you're punching in your answers, a couple of notes here. Today's recording or today's presentation is going to be recorded. So if you need to dip out early or if you want to share the recording with a coworker, we'll have that posted on our prismatic.io/docs documentation site. There's a section called Prismatic Insider there with all of the previous sessions that we've done. The other note here, if you have any questions as we go, please drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom. I'll try to answer as many questions as I can at the end of the session. We'll have a dedicated Q&A time. If we don't happen to get to yours, because I'm anticipating there's going to be lots of questions here today, we'll certainly log all of those and make sure to reach out to you in your support Slack channel right after. So, kicking things off, I've got a short slide deck and then I want to show some demo stuff. What problem are we solving here today with AI assistance? First problem, traditional integration development takes a long time. Integration development involves a lot of things. You need to do some research for, third-party APIs. You need to plan out your flows. You need to know what sort of authentication they use, and especially if they use OAuth 2, what are their token endpoints and their authorization endpoints, and how do you get a client ID and secret, etc. You need to know about rate limiting and error handling, and you need to build often repeatable flows that handle different record types and events. And there's all of these things that you need to do that classically a senior developer would plan some things out and then their junior developers would go execute. Nowadays, though, we've got this AI coding assistant, be you using, Codex or Claude or any of the other, um, they all start with C apparently, Cursor or Copilot. But if you end up using any of those, you effectively have a whole army of junior developers at your disposal that you can just start sending off to go do tasks for you. So the solution to integration development takes a lot of time is go grab a coding agent. Now that leads us to two other problems once you go reach for a coding agent. The first problem that you encounter is that AI assistants by default cannot access Prismatic. And by that I mean the LLM that you're interacting with, it's been trained on some stuff. It probably knows through its training that Prismatic is an integration platform, and it can sure go do web searches and find our documentation. But you can't just prompt the AI agent to like go list all of the integrations that you have in Prismatic. You're going to get a pretty generic response that says like, "Hey, Prismatic's a SaaS integration platform. Are you looking for me to look through your code here, or what do you want me to do?" This is kind of a classic problem with AI agents, not just coding agents, but AI agents in general. You can't just pick up a vanilla version of ChatGPT and say, "Go fetch me all my Salesforce leads named Bob." Um, it doesn't have access for first of all authorization. It doesn't have access to that third party system, and second, it generally doesn't know without looking through some documentation how to go about making those API calls to go fetch that data. And so the solution to this, and we'll talk in more detail in a moment, is MCP, Model Context Protocol, which is a method by which you give tools to your AI agent so that it can do things like go list me some leads in Salesforce or go list my integrations in Prismatic. Go figure out if Prismatic has a connector that I can use or go, publish my integration that I've built, that sort of thing. So we'll look at MCP here in a moment for this problem. AI assistants can't access Prismatic by default. And the last problem that we've got is AI assistants lack any sort of Prismatic context. Now, AI assistants have been trained on public GitHub repos largely, and public GitHub repos have a whole bunch of, React.js and Next and Vue web apps, and they've got a whole bunch of examples of Python and Pandas, data analytics stuff. But by and large, our customers, the organizations that use Prismatic aren't really open sourcing their code native integrations. So there's not really a lot of training on Prismatic stuff in general, and rightly so. It's your proprietary stuff. And so a coding agent, when you say, hey, coding agent, go create an integration with Prismatic, it doesn't really know if you mean go create an integration against Prismatic's API or use Prismatic to go build an integration between my app and the other apps my customers use. And there's a lot of other loaded terms that your AI assistant doesn't necessarily have context for. What is a flow or a component, an action, a trigger, a data source, a connection? All of these are pretty loaded terms that have meanings in other contexts, but it doesn't necessarily know that a data source in the Prismatic context means in the config wizard a thing that goes and dynamically fetches data and presents your user some series of options and a drop-down menu or a JSON form or whatever. It doesn't really know what flexibility you have in the config wizard to go, provide your users with a flexible set of options that they can select from. It doesn't really know how to invoke existing connectors that do exist. So if you say, I want to go send some Slack messages with the Slack component, it doesn't really have that context. And as an example of this problem, I got some permission to use this example, but one of our organizations that uses Prismatic, they had a project manager who really wanted to get an integration done. He didn't have development resources for a couple of weeks, and he figured, I'm just going to reach out to a coding agent and just see if I can one-shot a Shopify integration if I give it a good enough prompt. So he gave it a prompt, something like, I need a Shopify integration. It needs to have a field mapper in the config wizard. You should use Prismatic Spectral Library for building a custom component, blah, blah, blah. He kind of, I don't know what the exact prompt was, but something like that. And to the untrained eye, he was a very technical person, but not a developer. So to the untrained eye, it sure looked like the code that was generated was relevant to integrations. But to any of you who have built custom connectors and code native integrations on our platform, it got it hilariously wrong here. It hallucinated that there's something called the Prismatic IO client. That's just not a thing. It assumed that we used OAuth client credentials flow for authenticating. That's not what we do. We use, access tokens and refresh tokens. And then probably the most hilarious part of this was, I think by saying component in his prompt, it kind of naively assumed, well, React.js, it sure has lots of things called components. Prismatic might be a thing that has buttons and tables and input boxes and, all these kind of strange sets of things. So what it generated was just not even close to being a correct thing. So our problem is we need to get some amount of context into our AI agents so that they can do really meaningful, real things as you ask them to go build custom connectors and code native integrations. So that's the problem. Let's figure out the solution. How do you go about giving an AI assistant some amount of context so it knows what to do? Early on, I'd say in the front half of last year in 2025, it really seemed like Cursor was going to be the the pony to bet on. And so it set some standards, and one of those standards that was set was having some like project level markdown. And it came in a lot of forms. Claude allows you to have like a claude.md file at your project root. Um, More generically, a lot of agents will read an agents.md file. And these are like plain English context that's loaded every single time your coding assistant runs. So if you have a MD file, project level markdown file, when your AI agent opens up, it loads its system prompt and then it loads your client level markdown file. These files often have things like uh, a description of what the project is. Like this is a custom connector to Acme. Here's some best practices. We are handling rate limiting by Acme by doing, thus and such. We have some triggers that listen to Acme webhook events. Here's the file structure and the tech stack that we're using. And by having some of that context in place, your AI assistant can provide you some better results. Early on in 2025, we did create what we call our cursor rules. Again, it seemed like cursor was the way forward at the time. And so we created cursor rules, which were basically just a series of markdown files with some best practices for how to build custom components. And those were nice, but it kind of runs into two problems. The first one is your context window balloons like crazy. Your context window is all the tokens that have been loaded up, and if you've got just a boatload of descriptions of how to best build a custom connector and a code native integration, you wind up in situations where in your context window is a bunch of information on how to add a polling trigger to a custom connector. But right now, you might be working on building a JSON form in a code native integration. There's just a bunch of extra context that really doesn't need to be there. And it causes you to like burn your tokens a lot more rapidly. It costs more money to have all that context in place. And then the other kind of problem that you have is there's a bit of recency bias with uh, agent session where the interactions that you've had with the agent more recently have generally a bit more weight to them than the ones that were loaded up initially. And so sometimes some of that, initial rules and context gets swept by the wayside as you scroll down farther and farther. And if you've had 20 interactions back and forth with your AI agent, it just straight up just starts ejecting and forgetting some amount of context, which is a problem. That problem is solved with our third option here, which has something called progressive disclosure that we're going to get into in a moment. So, project level markdown, it's cool for very simple, description of your project. Not really the way forward now with these other two tools that we'll talk about here. So, next couple of tools. MCP. Chances are you've played with MCP if you've used an AI assistant. MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. It's something that Anthropic developed and used internally, and then it kind of became a standard for the rest of the AI assistants available. The idea with MCP is that it solves the problem where some third-party app has some data, you want to go interact with that third party, but you don't want your AI agent to just thrash for a while as it's trying to figure out how to interact with that API. So it's remote tool calls. I like to think of MCP in an analogy as a front end for your AI agent. And what I mean by that is like if you're interacting with some web app, you don't know all of the database calls and search filters and whatever else is going on in the back end of that web app. You make some request, you've typed in something into an input field and you've clicked search, and then that request has gone out. And what comes back then is some structured set of data that ends up getting presented to you. But all of the messy middle is kind of obfuscated by the tool that ended up going and fetching that data. MCP is the same way. You declare a series of tools by their tool name and description and invocation schema. For example, I might say list custom connectors that are named dynamics. And my tool might take a name of a connector, and it might know how to go interact with the Prismatic API and search for that connectors named dynamics, and it'll return a result to me because my agent invoked that tool. So it's great for interacting with third-party apps. It does things, our MCP tool that we have available and that we built on I think it was kind of the end of Q2 last year, has a lot of tools with regards to publishing integrations and adding component manifests to your code native integrations and whatnot. The thing that the MCP server doesn't do super like it's just not meant to do is giving your agent additional context for like best practices for building things. And so that's where this third one comes in here. And I'm proud to announce that we've been working on a set of skills that give your AI agent more context for how to build things. These skills are available today. I'm going to call it maybe a release candidate because we're continuing to iterate on them. But as I play around with them today, you are very welcome to install the skills yourself and start trying them out. If you do, please provide us some feedback through Slack. Our team is going to be working pretty heavily on it over the next couple of weeks here to try to hone these agent skills. And we'd sure love to get some feedback from you as you start trying them out. But skills, the idea with skills is they're formerly called Claude skills. They've kind of been rebranded to agent skills. Um, they're a combination of some markdown, some references, and some scripts that can be run. The name and the description of each of these skills is loaded up into your context window. But all of the rest of the stuff, the references and the scripts and whatnot, are only loaded as needed, which is pretty darn nice. It doesn't have this problem of the project level markdown where everything is loaded into your context window at once. It has something called progressive disclosure where, let's say I'm using the Prismatic skill and my AI agent gets to the point where it's creating a JSON form config variable. It will load the skill and the reference material needed just for JSON form config variables, but will not load all of the stuff for custom connector trigger development or whatever. So we've got some skills. We've got a Prismatic documentation skill that helps your AI agent search our documentation more readily. An integration pattern skill. I ran out of space to type. We also have a custom connector and custom component pattern skill as well. And then the Prismatic API skill helps your AI agent interact with Prismatic's API more readily. I feel like I've been blathering on long enough with a slide deck, so I want to throw this away here and start actually showing some demos of some of this. So I'd like to show some demos of these two final things, our MCP server, which we've had for about a half a year or so, and then our new agent skills, which are available today. And if you want to start playing around with them, I'd say please do so. So we're going to install and use the Prismatic MCP server for the first demo, and second demo, we're going to play around with Prismatic skills and hopefully one shot an integration with a decent prompt, try to get a full integration completely built out that I don't need to edit any code on. We'll see if the random number generator gods are favorable to me today, but it's got a pretty good track record the last few days of doing good work. All right. So let's look at some stuff here. First things first, I've got a VS Code open. I'm going to use a couple of different AI agents here just to show that they're compatible with multiple. If you're a Claude shop or a Cursor shop, or you're using Codex or Copilot, whatever, all of these concepts are pretty transferable. But I've got GitHub Copilot sitting off on the right-hand side here, and I might ask GitHub Copilot a question like, well, does Prismatic have an Odoo component? Does it? Let's see what it thinks. As of now, Prismatic does not provide an official built-in Odoo component. That's a dirty lie. I built that component 4 years ago. It totally exists. We definitely have an Odoo component. So that's a straight up lie. Turns out I've got doesn't have the tools necessary to I got lost for a moment there. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. My apologies, everybody. So, internet must have blipped out on me. It happens. So what I was just showing, in case it wasn't caught, by default, perfect. Thanks, Michael, for confirming. Perfect, thank you. Um, by default, I wasn't able to query Prismatic's components for a existing component, but I went ahead and installed the Prismatic MCP Dev Server into my VS Code. And now let's see if I up arrow enter this time. Does Prismatic have an Odoo component? Like seriously? It should identify that I've got a tool, Prism Components List, that I can search for Odoo. Yep, I want to allow that MCP tool to run. So it's going to go ahead and run. It's going to work a bit, and it says, yes, indeed, of course, Prismatic has an Odoo component. Why wouldn't it? It gave the LLM the ability to go reach out and do some API call that it couldn't previously. I can do other things. Who am I in Prismatic? Say something like that. It should run the prism me command. And if I go ahead and allow that command to run, should return that I'm Taylor Reece. I'm Taylor Reece associated with Acme Rocket Company. Here's your email address, etc. The Prism MCP server has a good number of commands. So if I go ahead and look at the commands that are available, the Prism commands, there's, I don't know, about a dozen or so different commands, a little more that I can do things like listing flows and testing flows and importing integrations and initializing new integration projects and all kinds of things that I might need to reach out to some third-party app, in this case Prismatic, to do. So I can do things, let's say I'll just show one more thing here. Maybe I want to uh, build and import my Acme widgets integration, something like that. I've got an Acme widgets code native integration here. I want to import that thing. Sure, go ahead and allow the thing to import. And I should see over time that it's running the probably npm run build behind the scenes, and then it's running an import behind the scenes as well. So it'll push all of my code up into Prismatic. It's been built, it's been imported, refresh my screen over here in Prismatic, and I should see Acme widgets. Sure enough, it was just updated and imported. Cool. So I've got tools. I want to make sure that this doesn't seem like some opaque black, you know, curtain that is just a bit of voodoo behind the scenes. Our Prism MCP server is a open source project, and you might have inferred from the fact that it says Prism. We've got a Prism CLI tool. Our Prism MCP server is effectively a wrapper around our Prism CLI tool. So if we go into the source code of our Prism MCP server that we have here, and I look into index, what did I ran? I run Prism integrations import. All right, here we go. We've got an integrate or got a server tool. So behind the scenes, MCP is just a series of tools that are written in code. In this case, we're using an MCP client that is able to expose the Prism integrations import tool to our agent. So we've got a Prism integrations import tool right here with a description, import a Prismatic Code Native integration, import a Prismatic Code Native integration from a specific directory. And it exposes a few things to the LLM, like, well, what directory are you looking to use? Do you have an idea of an integration? That's an optional thing. Um, is there a path for an icon that we should use, etc.? And what it ends up doing is just running some other stuff. In this case, it runs a npm run build command. It runs the Prism integrations import command with those parameters. And it does it, I think what's most important about it is it does it in a predictable way. There's not a there's not a bit of like uncertainty or random number generator going here that's gonna have your LLM go and agent go off the rails. Um, it ran the program and it knew here's the recipe uh, for doing a publish or a import of an integration. It's build it and import it and do it in a deterministic way. So that's demo one. Again, MCP, its main goal is passing or giving your AI agent tools to go interact with outside things. Not all MCP servers interact with outside things. Like I've seen MCP servers that do things like, let's say, parsing PDFs. PDFs are classically like binary files that have, unique formatting. Um, and so you might have an MCP server, let's say, that has tools for extracting text out of a PDF. And what that MCP tool will have then is it might not even reach out to a third-party app. It might end up just having some PDF loading library that is able to extract some data out. But again, it does it in a deterministic way. So there's example one, Prism MCP. Example two, and this isn't documented in our docs yet. Docs are forthcoming, and like I said, the Prismatic Skills, I'm gonna optimistically call it a release candidate, but it's a set of skills here that allows your agent to have more context for what good looks like with custom components and code native integrations. So let's go ahead and jump in. And I see there's already been a few questions. I will jump in and do some questions at the end, but great questions so far. So let's go ahead and switch. I'm going to switch over to Claude Code rather than Copilot, just for the sake of showing that this is compatible. These tools are compatible with multiple agents. And I'm going to go ahead and get Claude cracking on a prompt. Because as we all know, Claude, it's not an instantaneous thing. It'll take a few minutes to go build stuff. But I'm going to prompt Claude. I'm going to say with a build integration slash command, and I'll show you what that command looks like here in a moment. Notice it already grabbed the build integration skill and it's starting to do stuff. I'm going to say I'd like to build an integration that alerts my customers via Slack whenever a new Salesforce lead is created. Cool. When a user configures this integration, they should select a Slack channel that they want alerts sent to. Blah, blah, blah. Here's some more specs. They should use OAuth. They should use existing, integration agnostic or like reusable connections. Um, I'm gonna give my prompt a little more help here and specify like a very specific polling trigger that I know the Salesforce component has that I want it to use. Can I get a link to the repo? Because I'm lazy. Absolutely. There you go. Um, so uh, so I'm gonna give it just because it might it could go off the rails if I don't specify what trigger to use. There's one of a few that it might select. Um, it's kind of a garbage in, garbage out sort of thing. But what I got to here now is the build integration skill started. It started thinking for a while and it started invoking a few scripts that are associated with the skill. Um, so it ended up running something called prerequisites.py, and we'll dive into what that script does in just a moment here. But it does some initial setup, and then we want to make sure that generating integrations is a pretty repeatable thing. And so we created a DAG, directed acyclic graph, effectively like a decision tree, um, so that our AI agent knows what questions to ask about as it starts planning out the building of this integration. So you might have seen a file started being created here, requirements.txt, and a couple of the requirements it already knows. It knows that we're syncing Salesforce to Slack based on my prompt. They know based on my prompt, I said that it should prompt the user based on how often they want the flow to run. So it knows that it's going to be some type of scheduled trigger. And now it's asking me something that I didn't specify in my prompt. How often should this integration run? So I'm going to say, well, by default, let's say every 5 minutes. Sure, why not? And I'm going to go ahead and submit my answers. But what it's done so far is it's gathered some information. It's identified that, what systems am I connecting to? It identified that there was already an answer provided in context, but for any question that it doesn't have any context for, it's given pretty specific instructions to say like, hey, you need to ask this user how often you want their integration to run. And then later on, like here's exactly the choices that you should provide them. Which prismatic component should be used? Oh, I ended up having a couple of components. There's the Salesforce component that Prismatic provides. I also created a private component called the Salesforce Field Mapper, and it just wants to be sure. I specified Salesforce. It wants to be sure that I want the Salesforce component as opposed to the, custom one that I went ahead and built. So it's going to continue to think about these things as it goes. I might have it just sitting off here on my right-hand side because I want to look at, again, behind the curtain, make sure that's not this big opaque thing. Um, so Prismatic Skills, uh, got a README if you want to install the thing installation. If you're using Claude, you can use the /plugin command to add the skills, and it adds it via virtue of being a GitHub repo. But here we go. I'm going to go submit some answers. And so the command that I ran, I want to get started at the command. The command that I ended up running is this build integration command. It's a markdown file. And the important bit that I want to show within this command um, is this front matter that's on top of the markdown file. It's got a name. It's the build integration command. It's got a description. It knows that it should use the CNI builder agent that's defined within this repository. And it's allowed to do things like run bash commands and read and write files and edit files and do glob things and grep things. And it's able to ask users questions, which is why right here I'm able to be prompted for some questions about my integration. It's also given a bunch of information about like, hey, here's the things that you shouldn't be doing. Here's the things that you should be doing. Here's some scripts that you should run, like the prerequisite script, and then later on, you should be running the gather requirements script and go ahead and, ask a bunch of questions of the user and whatnot. So all good questions to be asking. So that's the command. Next thing I want to look at is the skill that it ends up running, because this agent here, the CNI builder agent, if you look at that, you might notice that it has the integrations pattern skill available to it. And I want to show off what that skill ends up looking like. You might notice that a lot of this is markdown so far. Quite a bit of the quite a bit of like AI skills are markdown files. But getting into the skills here, this is where we're going to see, in addition to those markdown files, some examples and some scripts that can be run as well. So I'm going to look in the integration pattern skill, which is one of our 4 skills that are available. And I'm going to look at the skill.md first. You might notice if you scroll down, skill.md is pretty darn short. This is something that I learned recently as we were developing these things. It's important for skills in order to not balloon your context window. In order to, it's important to have those as pretty short and sweet files. Generally, it's recommended that they be fewer than 500 lines. So our skill, our integration patterns skill, has a bunch of architecture patterns and information about manifesting components and configuration and whatnot. But largely it's references to other more precise and elaborate bits of information. Like if I look down the way here, we've got a reference. If let's say you're building a JSON form for a complex config wizard, we've got a references CNI examples JSON forms.md. And what's cool about having it this way is that um, if my agent is building a code native integration and it gets to the point, it's built out my flows and it gets to the point where it's building a JSON form in a config wizard, only at that time is it going to load up the JSON forms information. So this thing is called progressive disclosure. It only discloses some context at the point at which it's handy to have. And it's super helpful in, not ballooning your context window. So at the point at which we start getting to where we're like building a JSON form and building a config wizard, then it's going to go into references, CNI examples, JSON forms is what was referenced. And this thing's going to be a huge markdown file where it's got things like um, an example of a real world Jira field mapping form and how to use it within config pages and how to access the values within a flow, etc. So it just, this is where all the like kind of meaty context is, and the context is only loaded at the time at which you need it. I realize that shoot, I didn't click on a thing, so the Claude's gonna need at least 10 minutes. You know what I'm gonna do in the sake of time, uh, I'm gonna pop I went ahead and ran the same prompt this morning. I'm gonna pop the results of it just to make sure that we've got time to show off that like it actually ends up generating a thing. Salesforce lead Slack alerts. There we go. So pretend that I was actually paying attention and clicking things and it went ahead and generated stuff. What it would likely generate, assuming random number generators are on my side, is this same exact thing where we've got a component registry file that contains Slack and Salesforce. We've got some config pages that say I'm using a Slack configure connection and a Salesforce connection. Some information about the Slack channel and the polling schedule, etc. And then a flow that's going to do things like use that Salesforce polling trigger that I wanted it to use. Make sure the trigger runs on a schedule that runs, every n number of minutes based on customer definition. And then when it receives leads from created or updated records, then go ahead and do stuff like sending a Slack message over to Slack and do this all with existing custom connectors. I promise I one-shotted this integration. I did not touch a single bit of code within this integration, but if I go ahead and say, you know what, I don't have my MCP server installed in this repo. I'm going to go ahead and just Prism build. I do want to show that this thing actually works, so I'm not just, not just bluffing here. Prism integrations import. Open that thing. Let's go and get ready to add a lead because I know we're down to 5 minutes here. So I've got a brand new integration. I'm authenticated with existing connections for Slack and Salesforce. I can pick a Slack channel like my AI Insider webinar channel, say, yeah, let's run every 5 minutes. And then if I go ahead and run my integration, I'll get some nice logs that say, well, didn't find any changes because it's, the first time running, but let's run this thing again in just a moment here. Salesforce, let's go ahead and create a new record. Jane Doe from Acme Corp. Corpo, whatever, is an email of jane.doe@me.com. Cool. The next time my integration goes ahead and runs, we get a nice little alert in Slack saying, hey, Jane Doe at Acme Corpo just became a lead. So that's a whole lot to throw at you. My goodness. Quick recap, MCP, the first demo, that connects your agent to the Prismatic MCP API and allows you to do stuff with the API. And then the skills give your agent context for building code native integrations and custom connectors. We've got a lot of connectors out of the box, so you should be able to yank those down pretty readily. Q&A. Looks like we've got a ton of Q&A questions. Great questions. Yes, the skill is available to you right now. Link is in the Zoom chat. How complicated of an integration can you make with an AI at this point? Are there any issues we should look out for? That is a great question. How complicated of integration? I've seen it build some pretty decent field mappers on the config wizard side, and then I've seen it like as soon as it has the structure for a flow, like it knows what a flow should look like with like on execution and on trigger deploy or on trigger functions and whatnot. Uh, from my experience, the rest of it is generating some Node.js, some TypeScript code, and AI agents are pretty darn good at running TypeScript nowadays. Um, so honestly, with this additional context now from the skills, uh, I would say it's able to build some pretty complex things. Um, Good question on the like which agents or versions are recommended that Prismatic works best with. Let me get back to you on that, Michael. I've just honestly been using whatever cursor happens to be defaulting with at the time. That's usually Sonnet, but and so far it's had some pretty good track record for me. But I'll ask internally. I know our connector team that maintains our connectors have been dogfooding these new Prismatic skills internally. I'll ping them and ask them what they found the most success with most recently. Last thing we want to do, because I know we're about out of time, I'm interested in what in upcoming sessions you'd like to see in the near months here. Um, we're releasing our AI Copilot for the embedded workflow builder. It's being beta tested by some of our customers right now, or early access, whatever you want to call it. That's a AI Copilot for your users. If you have the embedded workflow builder in your app, you can prompt a Copilot to say, like, hey, can you build me a flow that, has these branches and these steps? And it goes ahead in the low code designer and just builds it for you, which is pretty cool. JSON forms and field mappers, always a popular topic. Building custom components with AI, if we want to dig in a little more deeply into that, or the MCP flow server, which is the other MCP server that we have. It's the MCP server that allows you to connect your AI agents to your flows that you've built within Prismatic. If there's any others, just throw them in the chat. I know we're at time, so thanks so much for hanging out with us. Hopefully, this was worthwhile, and you all have a terrific afternoon.